In 1932, a farmer stood at the edge of 40 acres in the North Carolina Piedmont and looked at 682 tree stumps he needed gone. A land clearing crew from town had already given him a price, $3 a stump. He didn't have it. What he had was $11.40 in a coffee tin, a hand auger, and a cloth sack of saltpeter that had been hanging on a nail in his barn since his father put it there in 1897. By the next fall, every single stump on that bottomland was gone. He never wrote a check. He never rented a single machine. And when the county agent came around the following year to look at the corn growing where those stumps used to be, he asked which contractor had done the clearing. There wasn't one. If you've priced out stump removal recently, you already know where this is going. The going rate right now for pulling one stump out of a yard runs around $400, sometimes more, depending on how thick it is. And here's the part that should bother you. Almost every method that farmer used in 1932 still works today on the exact stump sitting in your yard right now. Some of them work faster than the machine you'd be renting. A few of them got quietly written out of the rule book over the decades, not because they stopped working, but because somebody figured out there was more money in you for getting them. We're going to go through 15 ways to get rid of a stump, ranked from the one everybody already knows about down to the one that actually explains why the other 14 exist. Along the way, you'll see exactly which ones got phased out of farm extension bulletins, which ones got regulated into a federal licensing category, and which one turns a stump into a glowing coal in the ground overnight. Stick around, because the story of how that farmer cleared 40 acres for the price of a sack of salt is going to make a lot more sense once you see the whole list laid out. Let's start at the top with the option you already know exists, because you should understand exactly what you're paying for before you decide whether to skip it. Renting a stump grinder from your local equipment yard runs about $150 a day. Hire a certified arborist to do the grinding for you, and depending on the diameter of the stump, you're looking at $250 to $450. It works, it's fast, and there's nothing wrong with paying for it if that's what your Saturday is worth to you. The machine itself only reached its familiar modern form in the 1950s, and by the 1980s, an entire rental industry had grown up around it, turning what used to be a chore you did yourself into a service you called someone for. That's not a criticism of the grinder. It's a genuinely good tool. The issue is that the rental economy needs you to believe it's the only tool. Drop down one level back before the grinder existed at all, and you land on the mattock and grubbing hoe method, the one that cleared pastures for generations before gas engines showed up on farms. Mattock in the 1890s cost about 75 cents at the general store. The same tool from a hardware chain today, it runs around $35, and it will outlast your grandchildren. The technique is simple. Dig a trench about 18 inches out from the base of the stump. Chop through the lateral roots as you expose them. Rock the stump back and forth to loosen it, and sever the taproot last so the whole thing lifts free. On a stump under 8 inches across, an average person finishes in about 90 minutes. Nobody banned this method. Extension services just quietly stopped teaching it, shifting their farm bulletins away from hand-clearing techniques through the 60s and 70s toward mechanical and chemical solutions that equipment manufacturers were more than happy to fund the promotion of. That's really where this list starts to turn, because the next several methods aren't just old-fashioned. They're the ones nobody at the rental counter is ever going to mention. Before the chainsaw became standard farm equipment in the 1950s, two men working a cross-cut saw could fell a tree and take the remaining stump down flush to the soil in a single afternoon. The trick was never leaving a 2-foot stump behind. You cut it down to 2 inches, then drove splitting wedges into the crown along the grain, working outward toward the flare roots until the whole remaining mass split apart into the ground. A crosscut saw in 1920 cost about $4.50. A restored one sells to collectors today for around $150. This was the standard taught in United States Forest Service field manuals through the 1930s, and it disappeared from extension curricula by 1972. Right around the same years, consumer chainsaw sales tripled. Go back further into the era between 1868 and 1890, and you'll find that the U.S. Patent Office issued more than 400 separate patents for stump pulling contraptions. Cast iron tripods, screw jacks, chain and lever rigs. A farmer could buy one in 1885 for about $22, hook it to a team of oxen or draft horses, and multiply his pulling force 10 to 20 times over. A job that would have taken 2 grueling days by hand came out of the ground in 20 minutes. Nobody outlawed the stump puller. Manufacturers simply stopped building them once the market shifted toward machines you rent instead of own. The modern equivalent is a hand crank cable winch anchored to a standing tree or a truck bumper, and a 3-ton winch runs about $70 new. Penn State's agricultural engineering bulletins were still recommending cable winch removal for stumps under 12 inches on small acreage as recently as 2018. Now here's one that takes patience instead of muscle, and it's a method almost nobody talks about anymore because there's genuinely nothing to sell you. It's called girdling or ring barking, and you do it to a tree before you ever fell it. You cut a ring about 4 inches wide, clean through the bark and the cambium layer underneath, all the way around the trunk, roughly hip height. The tree keeps standing, but it can no longer send sugar down to its root system. Within a year, sometimes 2, the entire root mass dies in the ground on its own. Then when you finally fell the tree, the stump comes out with almost no resistance left in it. The woodlot management manuals from the 1780s describe this exact technique, and the British Royal Society of Arts published on it formally in 1795. Extension Services eventually stopped mentioning it for the simplest reason imaginable. You can't sell a farmer a product to make patients work faster. If you do reach for a chainsaw, understand what it's actually good for here. It is not a stump grinding tool, and trying to use it that way will wreck the bar. What it's good for is taking the stump down flush with the soil line, so one of the slower methods underneath it can finish the job. A homeowner-grade saw costs around $300 and will last 30 years if you keep it sharp and out of rocks. Worth saying plainly because the CDC tracks roughly 36,000 chainsaw injuries a year in this country, most from kickback when the tip catches dirt or a hidden object. Full protective gear, a magnet check for buried metal, a saw kept clean of ground contact. That's not optional advice. From here down, the list stops being about equipment entirely and starts being about biology, chemistry, and time. And this is exactly the point where the rental yard loses its grip on you because nobody can send you a bill for patience. One option that almost never comes up because there's no product attached to it is fungal inoculation using oyster mushrooms. You drill a grid of half-inch holes about 2 inches deep and 4 inches apart across the flush-cut top of the stump, then pack each one with a plug of oyster mushroom mycelium, which you can order for roughly $1 a plug from any mushroom supplier, and seal the holes with cheese wax. Over the following 12 to 18 months, the fungus consumes the stump from the inside out, and along the way you can harvest around 10 pounds of edible oyster mushrooms per stump per flush. The underlying science comes from USDA Agricultural Research Service. Work on Pleurotus wood decay, published in 2011. And Penn State Extension put out a homeowner-focused note on the technique in 2020. Almost no extension agents bring it up today, simply because there's no bottle or machine attached to recommend alongside it. Deeper in Appalachian tradition sits the charcoal pit smolder, a method mountain colliers used on any stump too large to pull by hand or team. You bore 2 holes into the top of the stump at an angle meeting near the base of the crown. Drop hot hardwood embers down one hole and let the second hole draw air. The stump smolders for 2 to 4 days straight, consuming itself down into the root crown without ever throwing an open flame. It was standard practice for oversized stumps well into the 1800s. Today, most states with air quality boards have made open agricultural burning either permit-only or outright illegal during fire season, starting with California's Air Quality Management District, writing the first serious restrictions in 1976, with other states following since. If you're in a county where it's still legal and the season allows it, it remains one of the most effective methods on this list. If you're not, it isn't worth the risk, and you should know your local burn rules before you even consider it. There's one method that belongs in this list purely as history because it explains exactly how a widely available farm tool became something you can no longer legally buy. Between roughly 1900 and 1930, DuPont sold dynamite formulated specifically for clearing stumps and boulders directly to farmers by mail order and out of ordinary hardware stores. A 50-pound keg cost about $6 in 1915. The company even published its own instructional pamphlet in 1910, and by 1917 had shipped more than 100 million pounds of the stuff to American farms. Nothing on this list cleared land faster. Today, federal explosives licensing under the modern structure established by the ATF in 1970 makes it functionally impossible for a private landowner to buy any of it. This one stays at the level of history rather than instruction. The point isn't that you should go find some. The point is that a farmer in 1915 had a legal tool for this exact problem that simply doesn't exist for you anymore, and understanding why helps explain the pattern running through this entire list. Back to something you can actually buy at any hardware store. Plain rock salt handles stumps under about 16 inches for next to nothing. Drill a grid of 1-inch holes into the top of the stump, 6 to 8 inches deep and 3 inches apart. Pack them with ordinary sodium chloride ice melt salt, not the iodized kind from your kitchen, and cap them with wax or dirt. Rain does the rest. The salt draws moisture out of the wood and disrupts the stump's cellular chemistry, and within 6 to 12 months, the wood turns punky enough to break apart with a mattock. In 1935, rock salt cost about 2 cents a pound at the co-op. Today, a 40-pound bag runs about $8, and it does essentially the same job as the $14 bottle labeled stump remover on the shelf at the garden center, most of which contain potassium nitrate and carry the same 4 to 6 month timeline printed in the fine print at several times the price. If patience is genuinely your cheapest tool, the tarp method proves it. Cover the stump completely with heavy black plastic or a tarp, weight the edges down with stones or soil, and leave it alone for 6 to 12 months. Cut off from sunlight and gas exchange, the stump can't photosynthesize or respire properly. It goes dormant, then soft, then crumbly. University of Florida Extension bulletins from 2019 confirmed the underlying chemistry behind exactly why this works. All it costs you is the price of a tarp, about $20, and you can reuse the same one across a dozen stumps over the years. Boiling water handles smaller stumps the same way Ozark truck farmers used it on the root suckers that kept showing up in their vegetable rows every spring. Scrape back the soil to expose the top of the stump and its shallow lateral roots. Bore or chisel a few deep pockets into the crown, and every 3 or 4 days for about a month, pour a full kettle of boiling water directly into those pockets. Water at 212 degrees ruptures plant cell walls and cooks the cambium layer dead. On a 6-inch stump, 5 or 6 kettles finish the job entirely. No product, no permit, nothing but the fuel it takes to boil water. Epsom salt follows the identical drilling pattern as rock salt, but with magnesium sulfate instead, available at any drugstore or garden center for $6 to $8 per 4-pound box. Fill the same 1-inch holes, cap them, and wait 3 to 9 months while the magnesium sulfate pulls moisture out of both the wood cells and the fungal defenses the stump would normally use to resist decay. The USDA Forest Service issued a fact sheet on this exact process in 2016, and the University of Florida cross-referenced the same chemistry against rock salt in 2019. The real advantage over rock salt is that Epsom salt won't leave the surrounding soil too salty to plant it afterward, which matters if you're hoping to put a fruit tree or garden bed where that stump used to be. And then there's the one that made that Piedmont farmer's stumps glow like coals in the ground at night. Same drilling pattern as the 2 salt methods before it, but packed instead with potassium nitrate saltpeter. Still sold today under the label stump remover at most farm supply stores or as an ingredient in cold packs. Cap the holes and wait 4 to 6 months while the saltpeter accelerates decay all the way down through the finest lateral roots. Then, on a still dry evening after a stretch of dry weather, Pour a small amount of kerosene into the holes and light it. Saltpeter-soaked wood doesn't flare up like a bonfire. It smolders down inside the root crown, glowing orange and red for 1 to 3 days straight, consuming itself from the inside out. That farmer in 1932 used exactly this method on 200 of his 682 stumps. By 1976, California's Air Quality Management District and more than a dozen county fire authorities across western states had written the open ignition of chemically treated stumps out of legal practice during fire season. Know your local burn restrictions before you ever consider it, and never attempt it in dry conditions near anything flammable. Which brings us to the real point sitting underneath all 14 of these. It was never really about any single method. It's about the fact that every one of them still works. None of them require you to be young or strong or specially trained, and not one of them requires writing a check to a rental yard. What separates the stump-covered yard from the cleared one was never money. It was knowing which of these tools already existed and which ones the market simply stopped mentioning once it figured out there was more profit in your forgetting. That farmer never called a contractor, never signed an invoice, and cleared 40 acres for the price of a sack of salt and a Saturday. The next time someone quotes you $400 for a single stump, you'll know exactly how many cheaper ways there are to get the same result, and exactly why almost nobody mentions them anymore. If this changed how you're going to handle that stump in your own yard, give the video a like for more of these and drop a comment with which method you're trying first.